Welcome to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, and welcome to 2022. And for this first show of the year, we're going to take a look back at some of the events that stand out for Barrie and area and South Central Ontario residents.
And who better to join us on this show to review and go over those notable events than a familiar voice to many in Simcoe County. And also on digital media, we've got Brett Glover joining us. Brett is an award-winning journalist for the past 15 years, covering all things, well, local and I suppose national, Brett. And 2021 was a big year, and you certainly were covering it on a daily basis. Anything stand out to you as sort of your biggest event of the year?
Well, I'll tell you, boys, this was definitely a year where there were a lot of things to talk about. I mean, everything from COVID to education. But the thing I think stands out most for me is not COVID related at all. In fact, it's the tornado that struck South Barrie. I think that's what affected a lot of people the most. And in fact, you look in the south end of Barrie, you still see the effect now. It's still lingering. People are still dealing with the damage, still dealing with insurance. And it's a news story that's still ongoing to this day.
Yeah. And
I would certainly agree. And by the way, thanks for tying that into a show that revolves around all things real estate. So nicely done, sir. But you're right. Absolutely. I mean, it was certainly notable for many people. It brought back memories and flashbacks to, I believe, 1985. But certainly those of us who thought that, there would be preparedness and that there would be effective response. The one area that there really was effective response was from within the community, neighbors themselves. As you mentioned, lingering effects with people who are certainly dissatisfied or underwhelmed by the service offered by insurance companies and of the sort. I think you're right. It certainly does linger. Mike, I cut you off there.
Yeah, no problem. What I was going to say is one other thing that was prompted by this event was a relook at our building code in Ontario and just how safe our homes are in regard to storms, an F2 or an F3 tornado coming through. How well do our homes stand up? Can we build our homes better? And they are taking a look at introducing something, I believe they're calling them hurricane straps, to help fasten roofs to a greater degree than they are under current building code standards right now.
I do know that's something that City Council was looking into for sure. I believe it was Councillor Natalie Harris that put it forth. And she was fairly well touched by this.
She was at ground zero. Yeah.
Exactly. So she definitely saw the devastation firsthand. There's the jury's still out on whether or not those hurricane straps will do anything for us, though.
But Brett, tell me though, what was the thing that was the biggest takeaway? Obviously, that's not sort of a passing story. It's not just that's getting its 5 seconds of fame. That's one, as you said, continues to linger on today. What would you say though was your greatest takeaway during that event?
During the event, I think, Arif, you already touched on it. It was the community involvement. It harkens back to, I don't know if you guys remember 100 Little, the apartment building that burnt down, and
very well.
The vast, the outpouring of support. Arif, you and I helped organize a clothing and toy drive for those affected by it, and we ran out of space to put all this stuff. And the same thing happened for the tornado. It was amazing to see our community come together like it always does. It just, that's my takeaway. I know that a lot of people are still very affected by it. Like I said, they're still dealing with insurance companies. Some people still don't have a roof over their head. Yeah. But the fact that the community was able to come together like it always does, that's what I took away from it.
Let me ask you though, Mike, you touched on the fact that obviously, and Brett, you mentioned it was Councillor Natalie Harris who happened to have herself and her son there in a home that she was in when it touched down. Obviously, though, her video, I believe that she shared, did go viral. Brett, talk to us just for a moment about how does viral video, or when video goes viral, how does that affect the news cycle, and really help us sort of burn that into our memory that it doesn't just go away as a passing fad, so to speak.
Well, the problem with viral videos is there's always another one coming up next, right? Yeah. So Natalie, all due respect to Natalie, she had her 15 minutes of fame, and then it was moved on to a different type of video. Yep. Luckily, a lot of people locally saw that. So yes, a viral video definitely touches a lot of people across the nation, across the world. Let's be honest, social media. But
if I can use viral as a cheap segue, one other event that really stands out as a result of COVID-19, and this was news again, provincially and nationally, as Barrie saw Roberta Place, one of our long-term care facilities, lose 71 people over the course of January and February due to an outbreak. I mean, there were a number of homes that had casualties, fatalities from COVID, but I believe Roberta Place was probably the highest numbers. That was really sad to see, and a lot of families impacted by that.
Now, as a reporter reporting in this community, to have to report on something like that was heartbreaking.
Yes.
It really was heartbreaking to have to deal with that every single day. I mean, yes, I'm far from it. I do have my in-laws actually live there. My partner's there right now. So it was just devastating to have to hear that over and over again. And yeah, it was just.
Yeah. And having a parent in long-term care myself, you know, there were a lot of on-edge feelings for any family who had someone, especially when you have someone long-term care who you don't have the facilities or the capacities to care for them safely at home. So it's not even an option to pull them out of the home in the midst of all of that. And just living day by day, going through that was very traumatic.
No, I hate to bring in a phrase, but as you say, humanizing was the one thing that really stuck out for me. It was an event that, for a whole variety of reasons, obviously, Mike, you said you've got a parent in long-term care, as do I. Brett, you said your partner's there as we speak. It certainly did create, I suppose, I don't want to call it a silver lining because I think it's anything but that, but an awareness of the impact of how fragile the system is, of how human error can play a role in the sense of not necessarily from one person or another, but I know there was conversation that somebody had been traveling and they were the host, I believe is the term that brought it into the ecosystem or that environment. We obviously know the story of a remarkable human being who has served for a number of years at Roberta Place, who himself, quite young of age, relatively speaking, was dramatically impacted and has recently, I believe, made a recovery. And I know that became part of the story, and how to make the system better. I think we did talk about the fact that the SARS report came out a number of years ago and appeared to only have collected a whole bunch of dust. And suddenly it became a catalyst to say, well, we need to open that book and start implementing a number of these protocols. Brett, my chronology of events may be off. So how do you recall really that story unfolding in its various forms, if you will?
Well, stories like that tend to unfold in a sort of a slow burn. You start to see a few statistics trickling out, and then suddenly the entire thing is ignited, and it's all we can do to keep up. So yeah, it was over the course of probably 3 weeks, if I recall. No, we're going back to February, so my memory might be a little rusty. And like we said, a lot happened in 2021. But yeah, it was a slow realization that there was something wrong, and then it was all we were talking about.
Yeah, and it's easy enough to look back and refer to things as failures or where we've gone wrong. But I think in the moment, a lot of these things were just events as they unfolded. We weren't prepared for, because we have not been through anything like this in modern times. So I think we were learning as we went along. I mean, should we, in future come up against a similar type of virus and outbreak, I think we'll be far better prepared because we've learned a lot through this. Unfortunately, there's a cost to that learning, but nonetheless, we have learned quite a bit that we didn't know just 2 or 3 years ago.
I would counter that point a little bit, Mike, in that we did learn a lot from SARS. I was living down in Toronto during the SARS epidemic, and there was a lot of lessons to learn. And like Arif said, what we learned sat on a shelf and collected dust.
Mm-hmm.
So with that in mind, though, Edwin Ng, really, the PSW who worked at Roberta Place, I believe he's still employed there. He came home after about 5-6 months in a whole series. I'm assuming that included intensive care, et cetera. Does this go in vain, or does the province name a bill after him? Do we make it count this time?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's on all of us to make it count. Let's remember all these lessons that we learned when we go to vote.
Yeah, there you go. Well said. So Mike, there was that. I mean, we can't, if we're going to be a little bit chronological about this, obviously there were the events in the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, the riots. Did they affect us north of the border? Does that mindset and that divisiveness that we definitely saw south of the border, pre-change of administration, if you will, as well, or post-change of administration, does that trickle into our mindsets due to the things that tie us together, including social media?
Yeah. Well, we like to think we are different from Americans here in Canada, but oftentimes what we see in the States as a precursor to events or behaviors we will see down the road here in Canada. So I think we got to be mindful of what happened over that and how it has and continues to unfold, both in looking at human behavior and looking at political behaviors, because no, we're not immune here in Canada. It could just as easily, something similar could happen here.
Well, I would actually point to the various anti-mask, anti-vaccine, anti-science protests that Barrie was at the heart of over the course of the summer. There was a lot of a very right-wing, extremely right-wing sentiment at those. I mean, as a reporter, I was threatened while we were there with violence. So, I mean, it's definitely bleeding through. It's up to all of us to make sure it doesn't.
For sure. There are no hard and fast political borders on or geographical borders on the internet.
Yeah, what's interesting to me, though, and I certainly want to point out is, yes, there are hard and fast all sorts of things. There are definitely hard leaning right and hard leaning left. The protest was not the greatest representation of our community, but I also would actually challenge our own beliefs to say that the protest was not representative of our community. It was representative of an arguably small fraction of people who happen to be in our community. And by the way, we don't have walls around us as some south of the border would have wanted. There are those for every protest, regardless, pick a protest. There are people who drive up the 400, so to speak, to join in when they hear about one, to show their support. So people at that protest, Barrie being the epicenter of the county, if you will, when it comes to all things, including services and health care, et cetera, likely attracted those from Angus or Wasaga or surrounding areas. Not to pick on Angus, you'll have to excuse me for that, people in Angus, but surrounding areas to come and join in.
Not just surrounding areas. Sorry to interrupt you there, but I'd point out that Maxime Bernier made an appearance at Barrie at one of these protests. So people were coming from far and wide. Now, it's not indicative of Barrie, but it definitely left Barrie with a black eye.
You'll note that I did say not the greatest representation of those in our area. We do have to go to break. And when we come back, let's pick this up. I'm enjoying this. Obviously, I'd like to, when we come back, talk about some things that are not COVID themselves, but certainly affect how COVID affected. And if you will, let's jump into something that I think we'll all agree on, which may be the continuing biggest or bigger story, which is the impact both on our children in the education system and the business community. Let's talk about, obviously, the hospitality industry as well, being once again really hard hit by this latest set of lockdowns announced yesterday. But we do have to go to break. Stay with us for more conversation with journalist Brett Glover, voice for years, a decade and a half of the region. Brett, thanks for joining us on Hitting Home with Mike and Arif. We'll be right back on Rogers TV Barrie.
Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, and we're reflecting on the year 2021 that has just passed us by. We're now into 22. We have Brett Glover, newsman Brett Glover, and Arif Khan, and we're having a discussion of the events that stand out for us and probably for everybody else in and around Simcoe County for this past year. And we left off before the break talking about COVID, which of course was the predominating story and issue that's impacted all of our lives over the past year. And I think will continue to impact on our lives in many ways. And a couple things that were impacted by COVID was our education system, and certainly how we look at and participate in our work, our day-to-day work here in Ontario. Arif, do you have anything, and Brett, do you have anything you want to elaborate on with regards to those two areas impacted by COVID?
Right, you go ahead.
Well, I think education was probably the biggest thing that impacted a lot of a lot of people. I'm a parent myself. My daughter, she's 8 years old and just found out again that she'll be learning from home. And I mean, she's strong, she's resilient, but it hurts. You can tell it hurts because she doesn't have the same interactions anymore. An 8-year-old doesn't go to school to learn things in a textbook. They learn how to interact with other people. And there's an entire generation that will be lacking in that regard.
Social skills, yes.
Exactly. And that worries me as a parent. I'm wondering how this will play out over the next decade.
Yeah, Mike, I agree with Brett. I've got 3 daughters in some form of an education system right now. One who spent first year, what should have been that, that coming of age experience going through, whether it's Frosh Week, I'm not so sure anybody should be too proud of that, but going into residence at university and just an entire different dynamic structure towards learning. She spent at the kitchen table in my house. And then I've got another one who's towards rounding out high school, and one who just entered into the education system and has spent half of her life with a mask on her face. You're right, Brett. I mean, that they go for all sorts of things beyond the learning itself. Certainly from a textbook, I've often said, if you're going to give me the textbook, just email me the PDF. I'll learn it on my own. But there is that interaction. There is a whole variety of people who learn differently. Some who learn auditory, kinesthetic, whatever it may be. But the mental health element certainly, I think, was what was predominant in terms of education as well. I'm not an educator. I'm an opinionated guy. So if my kids are going to be sitting at my kitchen table asking Dad what my thoughts were on a topic, they're getting my opinion. They're not getting someone who's a trained educator. And so I certainly think that all children and parents struggle. How do you balance earning a living, bringing home income to support the family with being an educator at the same time?
Yeah, and I would
yet. So. Sorry,
I'd add to that too, Arif. It took a toll on children, to be sure, and it continues to take a toll on children. You're right to point out it takes a toll on parents. We have to sit there. Well, we don't have to. It's our pleasure to sit with our children, but it's frustrating. And I think it's even more so frustrating that we as parents were not given much time to prepare at any instance in which this happened. I'll use the most recent example from the province as the example. It came a day before schools to start again. Yeah. Not even a day, not even 24 hours. And we all had to prepare for that.
Yeah. And without formal training as an educator. Yeah. For most of us.
It has tested the mettle, I believe is the term that used to be used, tested the mettle of the best of us in general. And I think, though, one thing that I have learned is that our children are more resilient perhaps than we are. We are certainly far more ingrained or entrenched in our habits and our ways of doing things. For some of us certainly for the younger ones, there were a lot of tears that were shed, both by children, but certainly I'm going to say more by the parents who felt helpless, or parents who are wondering how is their little one going to survive this. And I think if there is a piece of education that has come out of the last 21-ish months, was that our children have done a lot of educating of parents in terms of that resiliency that you talked about. They're okay. They're going to make it. This is certainly something that we will talk about for generations to come, as we do talk about, our predecessors, if you will, the Great Depression and the war stories and how we had to do things when I was a kid, walk uphill both ways to school, et cetera. I think that this is abnormal. This is not what we were used to. This was not part of the plan, but I don't think that anybody planned for this. That's part and parcel of the problem. No. We talked about SARS, that whole report sitting on the shelf collecting dust. Nobody prepared for this, but I do believe that our children will manage, they will evolve, and they will teach us how we're to do this better next time. If there is one, there will be one.
And the other element that we pointed out along with education is, I would say there's workplace and the economy in general, which I think we'll address separately, those two things. And just looking at the workplace, our jobs, how COVID-19 impacted, and it impacted differently for different types of work. Some people were able to continue in their jobs. Others weren't able to work at all. If you worked in the service industry, you may have found yourself at home well, your restaurant or hotel, wherever you were working, was literally shut down, your gym, whatever it was. And then there was others who were able to find some sort of a hybrid within there and work remotely. And this was something where the tools for working remotely were more or less being created. What we're talking on right now, Zoom, that's a term none of us heard of at the beginning of SARS, and now it's a common term. Zoom meetings for things. Working remotely is becoming sort of a norm. I think we will return back to, not completely back to where we were prior to COVID-19 in terms of the workforce. I think there'll be a hybrid that evolves out of that, where we work with some jobs partly at our workplace and partly from home. How do you
Brett,
see
what's
that
the
going
story
forward,
on
Brett?
that, though? Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because it seems like it's right now in the hands of the employer to make that decision. But I mean, enough workers start requiring that of their employers, then yes, we're definitely going to see a shift. So I think it's also partly the appetite of the worker. And I think that soon we're going to start to see, in fact, we're probably already seeing a whole bunch of businesses that will start offering that as maybe a perk, work from home because we know you can. And I mean, we've seen study after study that shows productivity was not impacted. And in fact, in many cases, was bolstered by the fact that we were working from home. So yeah, I definitely see that as something that will linger. I don't know what form yet, because I don't know if employers and employees know what form they want yet.
It's still being figured out. Yeah.
And I think that that's a real key. But Brett, first of all, you touched on something that I know you know what you said, but that was that it may be that the employees start requiring that of the employer. And I think that is one thing that has presented itself through COVID, is that there has been a bit of a shift in who's not necessarily who's making decisions, but who's influencing decisions.
Absolutely.
We talk about a buzzword right now called the Great Resignation, and some are saying, is it real? Is it not? Et cetera. Well, I think if there's one thing that we look around, you drive up any industrial area, or you look online at digital advertising, et cetera, you will see that there are help wanted ads everywhere. There are people who have decided, and we touched on just the beat up food and beverage industry and hospitality industry and tourism industry in general. There are those who said never again. They made potentially six-figure incomes, but certainly healthy incomes to support their families, a lot on tips, and realized that in a flash, their livelihood was certainly taken away from them. And there are those who are saying, I'm not going to go back into that environment. But in terms of work from home, in terms of productivity, well, first and foremost, I would argue that legacy companies must have known that this was possible, but were afraid of what they didn't know. What would happen? Would productivity suffer? We're paying huge rents on these downtown, if you will, Bay Street office towers, if you will, having people commute because that's the way we've always done things. And to suddenly have to adapt, well, I think what we did is we found out that it is possible. And we found out that there has just been, for perhaps a decade, resistance to it, not that it wasn't possible.
Yeah.
And I would say that, sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
I was going to say, and through that, we've learned that the value of the employee is much greater and dearer to the employer than we were aware of before. I think before COVID, a lot of employers have carried the mindset that you are replaceable. If you're not doing it the way we need it done, and quietly following the line, there'll be someone to replace you tomorrow. That's not necessarily the case in every industry now. There are many industries crying out for people. They've lost people through this. And so I think there has to be a change in mindset of the employer towards the employee in valuing them. So there's leverage there, and employees are realizing they have a little more leverage, that the ball is in their hand right now. And I think they're going to use that to their advantage going forward here. It'll be interesting to see how this unfolds in terms of wages, benefits, and just the workplace environment.
Brett, what did the Newswire tell you?
Well, I think the double-edged sword here, Mike, is that yes, the employers are starting to see more the value of these employees, especially the frontline workers, those who are working in grocery stores, those who are able to continue working in the hospitality industry. Unfortunately, these businesses were all very hard hit by COVID and the shutdown and everything else along those lines. Can they even afford to pay these employees more now that they understand the value of that?
Yeah, well, that's the other side of that. Yes.
Forward.
Well, I think that is a huge conversation, and Mike, it's something that we talked about offline. Was that I think we have to be very careful. There are the large corporations, which I'd like to get into in the third segment, because I think everybody would argue that there was not necessarily an equitable rollout of restrictions. There are those larger corporations, and then there are the which makes up about 87% of the economy, which is small business or small and medium-sized business. Oftentimes a sole proprietorship, oftentimes a family-run business, many of our restaurants, for example. But I think what ended up happening is that we saw that the corporations could be forced to pay pandemic pay, if you will, or a shift premium. I think it was around $2, if I remember correctly, to those working in frontline services, cashiers, food handlers, etc. And then that spilled over into now what we're seeing is, after the Great Resignation, almost a forced premium to be paid, or a signing bonus to be paid, because there were proprietors who were saying, well, I have a choice. I'm either going to shut down and lose my business because I don't have employees, or perhaps I'm going to forego my own compensation, my own take-home pay, and pour that back into my employees' payroll while I figure out how long that, maybe I can last a little while, and I'm going to pay that premium. But if I don't do something, I won't have a livelihood. I won't have a business to operate. So and that's just some thoughts that have gone through my mind. I don't know how much of that is science or fact, but I have to believe that you can't just come up with instant payroll without subsidy. It's got to come from somewhere. So where did it come from, and how long will it last?
Yeah. Well, where it comes from and how it comes out is what we're seeing right now. In part, it manifests through inflation. The employer has to pass those costs on, and they're typically passed on to those who are buying the product or receiving the service at the end of that line there. And
let's trickle this,
one factor,
Mike,
but there are many other things contributing.
Let's trickle this into the next segment. We do have to go to break, but I think when we come back, let's talk about how these restrictions were handed down over the last year, how they seem to be going into the next year. And also there is the topic of the fact that we've just had a federal election, what's come out of it, and what's the takeaway from that. So let's go to break real quick. I'll let you both think on it, and we'll be right back with more with our guest, Brett Glover, journalist, and we'll be right back with more Hitting Home with Mike and Arif on Rogers TV Barrie. Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif on Rogers TV Barrie, and we're joined by the soothing voice of Brett Glover, journalist who has graced a lot of our radios and podcasts and news feeds for the last decade and a half. Brett Glover, glad you're with us, and we've been talking about sort of the year in review, if you will, for 2021, and sort of what we went through and what we're continuing to go through, but what was most notable. And Mike and I can get excited. We can get carried away. We can banter back and forth. And here you are in the middle of my screen, and I'm staring at you going, well, what's this guy doing here if we're not getting your input from it? So we apologize, actually, because I don't think we let you get too much in that last segment. So your thoughts on you talked about education a little bit, but really the employment scenario and the challenges faced that we're still facing as employees and employers as we navigate through this, Brett.
Hey, I'm just happy to be here, guys. Don't you worry about that. But what I did want to point out was that I think that the pandemic really hastened a lot of technology out there. That's things that were already on the horizon as far as remote work and whatnot. I mean, Zoom. Who hasn't heard of Zoom now? But who heard of Zoom 2 years ago, 3 years ago, right? And the same thing is true for the education system, in that we all rallied behind these different types of virtual classrooms. And it just made it a lot easier to pick where you live, as opposed to having to sort of centralize yourself around the workplace, right?
Yeah.
And I think that was what's one of the many things that made a huge impact on 2021.
And if people really taken that up, and are they going to continue that? I mean, we saw something, not only was there the talk about the Great Resignation, but there was also talk about, and I don't know if it's in my own head or if it's something that was widely accepted, was the Great Migration. We saw countless people moving to the East Coast or moving north or east or west out of the GTA. Is that something that's here to stay, or will they capitalize on some quick returns and move back when the climate changes, if you will? What are your predictions there?
Well, I think it would be interesting. First and foremost, yes, the Great Migration is definitely something that it's not just in your head, Arif. That's something that was talked about. It was definitely talked about by me. I spoke with a lot of different folks in the real estate industry about this one. And it's interesting in that we're now able to pick where we live. We don't have to choose based on where we're working. Yeah. But I'm wondering what effect that'll have on future business, in that if a lot of people are migrating to Simcoe County from the GTA, will more businesses choose to do business and centralize their business within Simcoe County as opposed to working out of the GTA? So I think over the time, we might see a greater migration of industry, not just people.
I think so. And I think as industry realizes that there are benefits, there's certainly cost incentives. If you're on Bay Street and you can operate your business from Woodbridge, or any other scenario where you can leave that higher per square foot cost real estate that you're running your business on for lesser cost real estate, and also your employees can move with you, whether it's to Barrie, Bracebridge, or wherever. You're going to see a lot of that, and I think it's a matter of people getting comfortable with the idea and the mindset, and it's being tested right now, and it'll be tested further. I think a lot of the migration to the East Coast, I can't be certain of this, but I think that may be more of a trend than a future shift here at the moment. I think a lot of people who are close to retirement are probably moving there. I think a lot are going to realize the resources aren't there to do what they want to do to earn an income there. But the migration outside of major cities, like from Toronto to within an hour or two, or outside of any Canadian major city, that migration is here to stay for a long time. So long as
I'm going to jump in there,
property
Mike.
Values are as high as they are.
I'm going to jump in there and I'm going to offer something, and I'm going to suggest to you that for a generation or so, you can put the bookends as you will, I would suggest that the whole concept of a metropolitan area was because of things like economies of scale. It was because of infrastructure. It was because of traveling door-to-door salespeople, needing to go from one meeting to the next. It was from all sorts of things that were certainly brick and mortar related or tangible related. And now we have this, as Brett, as you mentioned, we certainly, all you need is a global pandemic to force to catalyze something that was going to happen anyway. Yeah. And I agree with you. All of these things were going to happen anyway. They just happened that much faster because they had to. You change what equals infrastructure, and you change what equals the way that people can do business. And that is, you still have hubs, but those hubs are in digital infrastructure. They're in Zoom meetings. They're in Microsoft or Google style meetings. We don't need to go door to door. We just go from calendar appointment to calendar appointment. Yeah. And as long as the infrastructure is there, whether it's broadband, 5, whether it's Elon Musk shooting something up into orbit, we now have a different version of infrastructure that will allow us to transact. Yeah. So I'm going to suggest to you that was a huge takeaway. I don't want to say thanks to COVID, but certainly due in great part to COVID. And I think that will change. Brett, as you said, will businesses move out of the GTA and centralize? I think they'll go as the Walmarts of the world tend to do, which is find the cheapest land, set up their shop, and people will build around it. I think businesses will go where the land is cheaper if they have to set up something like a warehouse or a distribution center. I think they will.
Extending this idea a little bit further, Arif, and I'm just going to change the subject a little bit here, is that this whole migration and the ability to choose where we work and the flexibility and whatnot, I think also brought about a new line of thinking for policymakers. I think over 2021, we saw a lot of discussion about universal income and as well the 4-day work week. And I think all of this is spawned from the same sort of mindset.
Yeah.
Well, what I'm
I'm
going to take an opportunity, Mike, real quick, and I'm going to suggest to you that we put the two together. And Mike, I think I know where you're going. There are those who have tried to legislate their way out of the pandemic. And I think that proved to not necessarily be so successful. We saw a federal election come in, and we saw some results. Let's talk about that. But Mike, I hope you're going to bring up the point around, well, what has the market shown us as opposed to legislating our way through things? What has the market shown us in terms of patterns, human behavior, and price points on housing because of these items that you talk about being affordability, et cetera? Mike, do you want to jump in?
We'll go into that. And home values is at the root of all of this. It's the motivating factor. I mean, when you pay $1.5 million to purchase a bungalow in Scarborough, and you can go an hour north and buy that same bungalow for, $550,000 to $650,000, $700,000. The term that I think we may have coined it on this show, drive to qualify. It comes into play, and a lot of the real estate sales activity in the past couple of years in Barrie, it's been predominantly people leaving the GTA, the greater Golden Horseshoe area, and coming north to Barrie. And there's just one other component within there, and you touched on it briefly, Arif, and that is, you mentioned Starlink and Elon Musk. We're shifting to a period of time where internet connectivity does not rely upon physical wires in the ground. Like with satellite internet, you can virtually have high-speed internet anywhere. And that's one of the things, even like pre-internet, we conglomerated for our business because we needed to be physically close. But even post-internet, because the speeds were slow and even non-available as you moved out of metropolitan areas, it kept people in those centers. But we're in an era now where you're going to be able to have high-speed internet virtually anywhere in the country. And that is really going to change the way we look at where we live and where we operate our businesses from. It basically opens up the entire country to do whatever we need to do. So it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. It won't be
Brett, housing affordability.
It'll be people moving wherever they want.
Housing affordability. Gentlemen, I bought a house in 2021 in Barrie, and it was a very difficult process. It was extremely stressful just to get a down payment. We talk about the lack of affordable housing in this city, but there's a lack of housing that's affordable for regular folks. Gainfully employed, good credit, and I struggled to find a way to buy a home here in the city that I've lived in for almost 20 years. I almost had to move way north because, like you say, and in fact, you're right. I think I heard this term first on your show, drive till you qualify.
Yeah.
I was looking up in Bracebridge.
Yeah, it's scary. And then there are even those who are going to renew a mortgage on their home. And if interest rates go up, people who've bought in the past few years and just squeaked into a mortgage, when they go to renew, it may be tough if interest rates are higher. So
as a mortgage broker, Mike, I would tell you that it's a conversation that I have with a fair percentage of my clients. And it's not about getting you into the home. It's getting you in the home and keeping you there, because when mortgage renewal does come up or time to refinance does come up, it has nothing to do with where you were when you bought. It has to do with where you are now. Do you qualify to keep your home? And that's a scary sounding proposition to have to address, right? Do I qualify to keep my home? Has my employment changed? Have interest rates changed? Have certain market conditions changed? Now, when you're in, typically, as long as you don't live beyond your means, you typically can stay. But what happens if your employment changed? What happens if you had to accept a single payment of CERB? Can for many, and did for many, change their qualification in terms of getting new financing. So it is a difficult conversation, but I will argue that housing affordability, if things were status quo, was already becoming challenging. It was already very challenging.
But
Those
what really
who couldn't qualify at 450,000, we're certainly not going to be qualifying when natural market segments pushed that same house to 775.
Yeah.
Add to it a pandemic and migration from the GTA, where people were selling $1.5 to $2 million homes and going into a $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 home. They were easily qualifying and putting people who were already locally in this market in a much tougher position. Add to that immigration that we need, it makes it that much more difficult, right? You know, it is a tough situation.
And I would add, over the course of the year, we definitely saw a prominence of numbered corporations buying up these houses as opposed to families, first-time home buyers. Young families who wanted their own home instead are seeing these homes bought up by a corporation that can afford to do so much more readily than they could, with fewer conditions as well. And I think that really pushed a lot of people out of the market and really put a lot of people off on house buying altogether.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, I think what stands out for me as a realtor watching in the last 2 years is the shift from local buyers of homes, first-time buyers of home, to predominantly what I'm seeing in the buyer category are people, again, coming out of the GTA, Greater Golden Horseshoe area, who have the means to purchase because they have a home that they've sold for over $1 million and they're moving into a less expensive market. But for those who are, again, looking to purchase that first home here in Barrie, who don't have the capital from the sale of another house, that's a long time to save for a down payment on a home, and that's a high month-to-month mortgage cost when you've got to finance, 80% of that purchase. It's left a lot of people out, which has put the demand, increased the demand for which was already a high demand on our rental market. And we do not have the rental stock here in Barrie to meet with the demand. And that has driven rental prices up. I can recall just 10 years ago or so when they were building up down Big Bay Point, between Big Bay Point and Mapleview Drive, all the homes there south of, or I guess east of Yonge Street. These were all nice high-end homes. There was a limit. You could not rent that house out for more than $1,500 a month. If you wanted to look for a house to rent down there, $1,500 was the price. Those homes now are renting for $4,500 a month, many of them.
Yeah, I was going to say 1,500. Wow, that's cheap.
Yeah, well, 1,500 gets you into a basement apartment in Barrie now. It's crazy.
So, Brett, I want to ask you the question, though. I mean, as somebody who recently entered into the home ownership market yourself, and congratulations, I'm sure it feels fantastic. What do you see, though, in terms of a trend going forward? I mean, it almost appears like we're in Groundhog Day just a little bit at the moment. But after the year that you've seen, and after you picked an interesting time to buy, I'm sure it wasn't exactly planned that way. What do you see as the human sort of motivation or the driving factors, or are we going to accept that this is the way things are? What's going to change, do you think, for the average Simcoe County Barrie resident going into 2022?
Well, I mean, if the rules around home buying don't change, I don't know if anything else will. In that, like I said before, a lot of corporations are buying up these houses and driving up rental costs and taking away stock. And for the average homeowner, their options are extremely limited. It's very frustrating to be in the housing market.
I mentioned the fact that there's a lot of different levels of government who are trying to discuss the concept of legislating change. And is that really going to make a difference, though? I mean, you can legislate foreign buyers all day long if you want, but if we're already 1 million homes in deficit in terms of the supply factor, if we're already there, regardless of foreign buyers.
Well, the point I'm trying to make, like,
evolution.
We could increase the stock. Like, it's not a question of inventory. We can build houses and build and build and build. But if these corporations are going to continue buying up these homes at prices that the average family can't manage, then it's just going to continue to become increasingly unaffordable for a small family.
I'm not, Brett, I'm out there. I'm active in the industry. I'm not seeing that corporate purchase to any great level. It does happen. They're investment corporations. They're usually groups of people buying homes to hold or to turn around, rent out as an investment. But I don't know that it's reached sort of epidemic proportions that it's having. I think the greater influence, it's there, it's a factor, but I still think the greater influence is that that differential between the price of homes in the GTA and Barrie, and how that's put Barrie on the radar.
So the cost of housing in Barrie increasing is more normalization, sort of coming.
Well, what ends up happening? Again, supply and demand.
I wouldn't call it normal. It's just a response to supply and demand playing itself out.
If we have 10 houses available in Barrie for sale, and you got 15 people leaving the GTA to move to Barrie, they're going to go bid for it, and that's just naturally going to drive the price up, right? So you know, and the fact is, the question is, has the GTA exodus finished? Has it seen the end of the exodus? Is it going to continue? And if we only have I mean, it takes 16 weeks to build a house, but it takes a couple years to service the land before you can do the 16 weeks to build the house. So the question is, you know, if we have more people moving to the area than there are homes being built and ready to hand a key over to, that is going to drive the price, right?
Yeah. That's so long as we have 100,000 new Canadians every year coming into the country, and a good chunk of them landing in the GTA, the demand for homes grows there. That's only going to further push the price of homes there. And you're going to see people expanding further out of necessity. That's not going to stop anytime soon. And I don't think government can legislate or penalize its way out of this problem. We've talked about it on the show many, many times. It's a simple solution in theory, at least on paper, and that is we need more housing stock.
With that in mind, though, we are way over on this segment, Mike, and we got to go. Brett, I want to thank you for joining us, and thanks for you know, jumping into the boxing ring with us, if you will, and sharing your thoughts and going a few rounds back and forth. I've enjoyed your contributions very much. Thank you for your past decade and a half in the local area, being the person who keeps us abreast of what's going on, and certainly adding your color and your editorial flair to the way you've delivered journalism to area and surrounding area. I want to thank you for joining us on Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, and we look forward to having you back on the show.
I'm very pleased you invited me. Thank you very much.
We'll be right back with a few final thoughts from Mike and myself as we wrap up a truncated fourth segment of the show, but we'll be right back with more.
I think we'll take a look forward when we get back, Arif.
There you go, right after this break.
Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, and we've just taken a look back at the year 2021 with our guest, Brett Glover, newsman Brett Glover. It has been an interesting year, but turning it around and looking forward 2022, Arif, I think the big issue of home availability and home affordability in our region will continue to predominate within the region. I think the market may quiet down as we get into mid or late summer, because the expectations are that interest rates will start to creep up at that point. And once they do, I think we may see a quieting down of the market. Any thoughts on that, being a mortgage broker yourself, Arif?
Sure, Mike. I think the writing's been on the wall for about 15 years that interest rates have got to go up, and I think now might be the time. But I think you make a lot of great points. Here's what I want to get into in terms of looking back at the last year. Again, don't discount the COVID factor. Cities were planning and have been planning, rightfully so, for multi-unit or multi-unit dwellings, whether that's condos or townhomes, et cetera, as a way of accommodating the influx, of accommodating migration, as accommodating growth requirements. And then comes COVID and puts a bit of a pause on that and says, wait a second, we want out of those downtown small units and small condos because we don't want to share elevators with people who might be contaminated. We want to live in a region that at least gives us a little bit of grass and some space. I think that that's been a factor. I think that the builders community has adapted to that and will adapt to that for the short future. But I do predict that we will go back to requiring, in order to address the issue, requiring more multi-unit homes to be built, maybe differently, maybe with ventilation. In terms of pricing and qualification, though, home affordability, whether it's rental or ownership, will continue to be an issue. And as I think there will be a day of reckoning, though, Mike, and that day of reckoning will be interest rates going up and people realizing that they might have stretched themselves a little bit too far. We're going to see households face financial challenge in some way, shape, or form. I don't believe it's necessarily going to be definitive and critical, but I think there will be a bit of a wake-up call for people to rein in some spending, live within means, and settle into some new realities as we continue to figure out what reality looks like.
Yeah, and with that, the built form for houses going forward, I think, is going to be predominantly multi-unit, multi-residential. Smaller, we're shifting our style of living. There was a little window there at the beginning of the pandemic where we thought we saw some demand for detached homes, but I don't think it's high enough that it's going to change developers' sights on what they want to build. It will be higher density going forward. And that brings about resistance, and that's a show in and of itself we can talk about. It's hard to adjust the new build into the residential area of the existing people, and that's an adjustment going forward. And I think we'll see, some friction with that in the year and years ahead as Barrie does and will continue to grow. I think the target is 250,000 over the next 10 to 15 years. Am I right?
Well, listen, we're going to go beyond 250,000 in the next, call it 6 years, to 325 in the next 10 to 12 years. I think that growth will happen. I'm going to suggest to you that there's been some commentary locally that said, look at us, we're doing a great job. We're addressing those issues. It's not look at us, we're doing a great job. For the last 10 years, we've been developing out, laying infrastructure in the South End to be able to accommodate this growth. We're just finally, for the first time in over a decade, in a position where locally we have land to build homes on, and not just the gentrification in internal sort of built boundary properties. But we will continue to see gentrification. We will continue to see growth of multi-units. We will continue to see subdivisions built. But I do believe that, as with any pandemic or any viral issue, it will continue to mutate itself out, and we will learn to live again. We will be, some of us will be vaccinated, some of us will be not. There will be filtration things taken into consideration in terms of how we build housing stock. Certainly, if it's communal housing, there will be more attention being paid on ventilation, for example. We do have to wrap it up, Mike, though. I enjoyed this. I like the format. I think it works very well. But we do have to go. Send us off, Mike.
Yeah, well, that was 1 hour with Mike and Arif with our special guest, Brett Glover. It was a good show, and look forward to future shows in 2022. And the topic of real estate will always remain on everybody's tongues there. So we're just going to do some great shows this year.
We'll see you again.